Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I hope that you're doing well. We're going to talk today about the motor system. So in some ways, I wish we had talked about the motor system before talking about the somatosensory system. But either way, the two are critically intertwined because we are constantly getting feedback from the somatosensory system in order to guide movement and vice versa. And the reason for this is that if you think about actions, and there are a few cases where actions are planned out, that an action is not something we decide to do and then we complete and then we decide to do the next action. Instead, we are constantly monitoring what's happening. And this is the reason why if you plan to walk down a sidewalk and all of a sudden your foot catches on the edge of the sidewalk and you start to lose your balance, then we start to take in information from the vestibular system and from our somatosensory system, and then we use that to adjust what's going on with the motor system. So we have to constantly monitor what's going on in order to be able to make changes. So we already talked about the sensory neurons that are involved in kinesthesia and proprioception. These are a critical part of this. We talked about the vestibular system, where we look at head movement, head position, balance, all these kind of things. Those are a part of this constant monitoring. Our visual system uses optical flow to guide all of our movements and to help plan for changes and what's going on in the visual world. And all of that kind of comes together in order to guide our muscles, which is what we're really is a main thing we're going to be talking about, is the signals that are driving muscles and then how those signals provide their own bit of feedback. So let's look at the structure of our skeletal muscle here. So skeletal muscles are important for every single behavior that you can observe, and this is everything from fine motor, like facial movements and talking, all the way up to gross motor, full-on walking and movement. These are attached to, all of our skeletal muscle is attached to the bone via tendons, and the important thing to know about this is that sort of the different properties of the two of these, right? The muscles are not quite as strong and rigid as the tendons are, and this makes a difference. So these properties become important for the way that we provide feedback, and tendons are not a passive part of the muscular system or the motor system. And then of course we have movement that occurs when our muscles contract, and there's a few different ways that this can happen. I know we have a lot of people in this class that are in exercise science. Many of you are probably have more expertise than I do in the muscular system, but we're going to talk a lot about how the brain interacts with this system. So an important thing to remember is, if you think about when people are talking about, like, hey, I'm going to flex my muscles, right? And this is, people just think of this as kind of tightening them up. But really, there's a definition for us that becomes incredibly important for understanding the give and take that happens across different groups of muscles. So flexion is the movement of a limb towards the body in a very opposite fashion to what you would think of, a bodybuilder doing. If you were to flex all of your muscles, you would pretty much end up in something that looked like the fetal position. Whereas if you extend your muscles, you're moving them away from the body. And so that's a definition that's going to be really important to us, because there's also muscle groups that then oppose each other, that are flexors or extensors. And it turns out that these separate groups, for good reason, need to be able to communicate with each other, right? So the muscles for flexion and extension need to communicate in order to guide movement, since they are kind of opposing but balancing groups of muscles. Another thing that's important to know is that, the opposite of what I just said about the fetal position, the extensors are almost more critical, because they are the muscles that keep us upright. And so they have a more important role in balance and posture and things like that. So while that's not exactly what we, think of for musculature, we're all used to the idea of muscles and flexing going together. I think that that's just more of a pop culture thing that's been ingrained in all of us. The extensors are actually the stars of the show, especially for human beings like us that walk upright. And here's just a basic diagram to illustrate what I was saying, where flexion, for example, with this leg is moving it back up and towards the body, and extension is moving something away or in the opposite direction of the flexion. So you can pause here for a minute if you want to take a look, or just go to this figure 8.1 in your book to take a second look if the concepts are not making sense to you. So it turns out that whether you know it or not, there are actually two different types of skeletal muscle. The first of these is called extrafusal muscle fiber. And so we've kind of got peeled away all of this extrafusal muscle fiber here in order to show both this extrafusal and these intrafusal fibers. The extrafusal fibers are really the main thing that you're thinking of when you're talking about muscles. So they're the ones that contract and do all kinds of work. And they're the ones that are really receiving messages from the spinal cord telling the muscle to contract. And these are grouped together in something that we call a motor unit. And the size of the motor unit, which kind of is the opposite of things we've been talking about in the sensory system, but the size of the motor unit dictates whether something is fine motor or gross motor. So if we have one alpha motor neuron that is connecting to 10 extrafusal fibers, then that would probably be more fine control than if we have one alpha motor neuron that is branching and talking to 100 extrafusal muscle fibers. So this is the exact same idea as we saw with convergence or divergence in the visual system. And what happens for anytime this alpha motor neuron is activated is that all of the fibers within one motor unit are going to contract. So this is the kind of the basic way that muscles work. We have a neuron in the spinal cord, it talks to an extrafusal muscle fiber, and it causes it to contract. And we'll get more into that in a couple of minutes. The second piece we have are the intrafusal muscle fibers, and you can see them peeled away on the inside here. And it turns out that these end up being kind of a hybrid of sensory and motor. And so for our purposes, we consider them part of the motor system. And I think you'll see why, because of the specific role that they play. But in truth, they have a sensory fiber that detects the stretch of the muscle. But then they also receive an input from a gamma motor neuron that allows them to also adjust their tension. However, they don't really carry any lifting force. Their job is not to do that, and yet they can be tightened, but the fibers are not strong enough to help you lift something up necessarily. So that's not their job. So there's a very special reason that they need a motor neuron and that they also have this sort of sensory stretch detector. And again, we'll talk about kind of how all this comes together in a minute. So first, let's just take a look at the structure of muscles. So if we look at muscle fibers, we would have this group of what we call myofibrils. And these are made of overlapping strands of two things that some of you have probably heard of, actin and myosin. And the actin and myosin basically work together to help muscle fibers contract. And what I want you to see here on the myosin is that there are these little protrusions that we call myosin cross bridges. And then if you look at the actin, we basically have something that kind of looks opposite of that. It looks almost like a DNA helix, but there are these tiny holes in the actin filament. And so these two are able to interact almost like a system of gears in order to pull the muscle and cause it to contract. So what happens in order to cause a muscle to contract? What's the physiological basis for this? So in understanding the connection that we have between the brain and the muscle, this brings us to a very special place we call the neuromuscular junction, right? So this is just a connection between our nervous system and our skeletal muscles. What happens at the neuromuscular junction is that there's a synapse between this alpha motor neuron that's coming in and our motor units here that are comprised of many different groups of muscle fibers. And you can see that these synapses can spread out. We're only showing this spread out very little here, but of course, as we already said, this could be spread out to where there's one neuron for 10 motor units or one for 100 or for 1,000, and that defines kind of the fine versus gross motor ability of whatever muscle we're looking at. So the terminal buttons here are just like the ones that we had seen when looking at synaptic connections in chapter 2. And these connect to the muscle at a place we call the motor end plate. And the job of this motor end plate is to create something that's kind of like an action potential, but we call it an end plate potential. And the way that this works is that we have a release of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which if you think way back now, because we're basically at our halfway point in the semester, to the history of physiological psychology, that was kind of the second lecture of the entire course, is that acetylcholine was actually one of the first neurotransmitters to be discovered, probably because of how ubiquitous it is. And so the end plate potential is created when acetylcholine is released, and then it causes calcium to enter into the muscle fiber. So much like we saw in the case of the auditory system, when we're trying to perceive sound and other things like that, there are many cases where in the periphery that we don't use sodium to signal other cells. We use calcium and potassium, things that are found in a little less abundance out in the body, whereas sodium is pretty readily found out in the body. So it's hard to signal with sodium at muscles, for example. And as with many of the things that we've discussed, this firing of action potentials follows something that's very much like the rate law, where the more action potentials that are fired by this motor neuron, the more acetylcholine that would be released, which means that more calcium can enter, creating a stronger end plate potential and stronger muscular contractions. So if we look at a zoomed in version of how this all comes together, I showed you a minute ago the actin and the myosin. And so when we look down at the level of one motor unit, inside each motor unit, the unit that's actually capable of contracting is called a sarcomere. And what happens here is that the myosin that we looked at a minute ago has these kind of heads or bridges on it, and these are able to interact with the actin. So what happens when calcium comes in is that the heads of the myosin kind of walk along the actin and pull the two pieces of the sarcomere together. And then when calcium is then removed again, because we stop having action potentials to that muscle, then the muscle relaxes again and the two spread out. And so this is what we call this sliding filament model, where these pieces of myosin basically slide back and forth along the actin, and calcium is what causes them to contract together, and then the absence of calcium again breaks them back apart. The second half of this that we need to talk about is how we get sensory feedback from our muscles. So what we just talked about a second ago for getting muscular contractions involves both the intrafusal and the extrafusal fibers, but is much more important for the extrafusal fibers. And now what we need to look at are these intrafusal fibers. So the intrafusal fibers are incredibly important for the balance that occurs in the motor system. These intrafusal fibers stretch when a muscle lengthens, and they relax when a muscle shortens. And this becomes very important for the way that we perceive our movement. One thing that you need to pay attention to here is the fact that then if I have an extrafusal fiber where I have one muscle that contracts, let's say that you're just flexing your bicep in the case that they're showing here, we bring this agonist muscle and we tighten it, then what this causes is the opposite, or the antagonist muscle, to lengthen. And so there's always a change in what's happening in these intrafusal fibers. One is shortening and the other is lengthening. And so that we always have these opposite signals coming in. So from these intrafusal fibers, this means we're getting information that acts kind of like a muscle length detector, where we have some idea of how much strain is on a muscle at any given time. Are they very stretched out, or are they kind of poorly stretched out? the same time, there are also stretch receptors in the tendons, which I was telling you at the very beginning of this lecture that they're not passive at all. And we call these Golgi tendon organs, and they detect the amount of stretch that's being exerted on the muscle tendons. And these two play in some ways complementary jobs, but they also have slightly different roles. Both of them are detecting stretch on a muscle, but the Golgi tendon organs are much more important for detecting really heavy strain on the system. Because if you're putting a lot of stretch on these very kind of rigid tendons, then that means that your muscles are actually straining. They're not really able to do their job anymore, and the tendons are kind of taking over to do the work. And at some point, that arm or leg or whatever body part it may be would have to give. So what we found is that there are actually multiple classes of intrafusal fibers, and then we also have this Golgi tendon organ, and they all work together to do kind of different things. So one class of the intrafusal sensory fibers is detecting slow changes or slow stretch in the muscle fiber. And so if you were to just passively lower your arm, like you see here, then you can see this first intrafusal fiber, this MS1 type, will increase its rate of firing as we end up having this stretching of the tricep here. The second class is responsible for more rapid movements. And so it makes sense in some ways that we would need both of these because if we go from nothing to fully stretched, then we want to be able to detect something about the velocity. And so if we drop the arm quickly, then of course these MS1 fibers, they will respond as well. They increase their firing rate. But for just a brief instant in time, these MS2 intrafusal fibers are also going to respond, saying that there was a rapid stretch detected. And you notice for that both of these that the Golgi tendon organ doesn't really do anything yet. But now if we add something like a strain that's happening, for instance, if something sort of unexpectedly hits or drops your hand, then you will absolutely notice that now the Golgi tendon organ becomes involved as well. So of course we have now all three parameters here where the hand or the arm still drops, and so we still have firing of these MS1 intrafusal fibers. We had a rapid drop because the weight hit the hand, and so we have these MS2 fibers involved. But now we also have strain, so we have these Golgi tendon organs involved as well. All right, so now I'm going to, for some of you, I'll blow your mind for a little bit, but I'll make a connection that you probably haven't made. Think about all of those times that you have gone to the doctor and they test your muscles. They say, push back against me as hard as you can, right? And they do all kinds of things. And some of them occasionally will do something like this, where they'll say, all right, I'm going to give you a high five and I want you to keep your hands in place. So in a very quick few minutes, they end up testing pretty much all of your motor system by just going through tests that look at whether these Golgi tendon organs are having problems or whether these intrafusal fibers are having problems, because your body in some cases should automatically have a reaction to all of these things happening. And if for some reason you end up with muscle weakness and inability to push back and hold your muscles in place, it could mean all kinds of different things, but it starts to hint at a motor deficit. And of course, if you really have a thorough motor exam at some point in time, they will start to kind of test each of these different things independently to determine where the give is. So we've said a lot about the muscle fibers, but at this point we really haven't said much about how the spinal cord is involved. So let's talk about that for a minute. There are a few different ways that the spinal cord can interact with the muscles to control behavior. So as you all might imagine, because we're in a class where we're talking about neuroscience, most behavior is controlled by the brain. We have planning of motor actions and things like that. However, there are some instances where the spinal cord can rapidly produce responses. And of course, we've also mentioned this a little bit because there are some cases where it's really advantageous for you to make a response without having to spend so much time thinking about it. And instances of pain or that could produce pain are one solid example of this. One easy example that I think you would all be aware of is called the monosynaptic stretch reflex. And what happens here is that a muscle will contract very quickly if we detect too much stress or strain. So what this involves is that we have a sensory neuron, and then this is connected through the spinal cord directly back to a motor neuron. So an example of this kind of a reflex is that when you go to the doctor, they hit your patellar tendon right on your knee. And of course, in this case, we're talking about a Golgi tendon organ, but this causes a very quick stretch response in the tendon, and then your knee makes a small kick. And something that's kind of important about this, because your motor system adjusts to changes and all kinds of things like that, is that they always make you do this with your feet hanging off the table. So if any of you are bored, you can go play with this spinal cord reflex by going and sitting with your feet dangling off the side of a bed or a chair. But this is exactly what's happening, is that this stretch creates a reflex that basically says that the body needs to do something, because there's been an instantaneous strain on that muscle, and the body needs to react in order to protect the muscle from extra strain. So if we look back at this example that we had a minute ago of the weight dropping into the hand, then this shows you the kind of correction that would happen, because of course you don't see that when the doctor hits your knee. So when something abruptly drops into the hand is going to drop down, but we don't want an incredible amount of strain on the muscle. And so the first thing that we try and do is recover the hand back to where it was, right? It helps us to maintain our body position in this way. But if you look at this in a completely different way, of course, maybe it's not that advantageous to be able to return your hand into position. However, these changes in force are happening all the time in our legs as well. And so a really important reason for having this monosynaptic stretch reflex, which doesn't necessarily have to be as violent as hitting the patellar tendon and having a leg kick out, is that if there's accidental changes in force because something happens while you're walking or moving, we quickly detect those, and without you even having to tell your brain like, oh no, I tripped on something, let me extend my foot to fix what just happened, your body automatically reacts in order to help restore posture and balance and things like that. And so that's kind of the first line of defense for any of these different obstacles or problems that we might run into. And what it also does is it buys a little bit of time for your visual, vestibular, somatosensory systems and so on and so forth to all work together to determine what just happened, and then plan a new movement and make any corrective actions, so that if whatever your muscles did in order to correct didn't work, you now have the ability to plan some way to fall gracefully, or whatever might happen depending on the circumstance. So another thing that we need to talk about is the role of the gamma motor neurons. So the gamma motor neurons, what I had shown you before was that these intrafusal fibers are kind of sensory, and that they detect when the muscle is stretching and so on and so forth. But we didn't really talk about why then they need a motor neuron. And the reason for this is that there are different degrees of stretch. And so the gamma motor neurons are basically there to change the sensitivity of these intrafusal sensory spindles. So the intrafusal fibers, much like the extrafusal fibers, can be contracted if we activate gamma motor neurons. However, just to remind you of what I said before, the activation of gamma motor neurons is not a muscle contraction, right? It's not something that you're going to use to lift weights. You can't go out and work on, your biceps and your pecs and your gamma motor neurons to be stronger next week. So what these do instead is they take these intrafusal fibers and they contract them to make them shorter and therefore more sensitive to future stretch. So they're really like a gain control system. They adjust the sensitivity of these intrafusal fibers by allowing them to become more or less sensitive. So let's look at a few different examples of what would happen for these intrafusal fibers, and then where the gamma motor neuron can come in. What we've already said thus far is that if we have stretch in a muscle, then whenever the stretch happens, that the intrafusal muscles will start firing action potentials. And of course, the other thing that we said is that if we have now the agonist muscle contract, that means that we actually take away this stretch on the intrafusal muscle fiber, and in that case, they should follow the rate law as well, and their firing rate should go down. And that's what we see happening here. But one thing you'll notice then is that if this intrafusal fiber is relaxed, it's no longer able to sense stretch. And that's actually not necessarily a good thing. The opposite muscle can detect some stretch, but there might be times where, let's say you are lifting something very, very heavy, and you need to be able to detect whether or not you have some stretch happening while lifting something. Now you have a system that's become completely insensitive anytime the muscle is contracted. And that's where these gamma motor neurons come in. Because as the alpha motor neuron stimulates this extrafusal fiber and causes it to contract, then the gamma motor neurons can come in and they can actually contract the intrafusal fibers. And what this allows them to do is to tighten them and to basically make them sensitive again. So they tighten the intrafusal fibers, and now the tension between the two matches, so that if while we're lifting this weight, somehow this intrafusal fiber stretches more, then we're going to have, again, a change in firing of action potentials that matches that. So this gives us the ability to, again, set the gain or set the sensitivity of these intrafusal fibers. All right, now let's stop for a second and talk about polysynaptic reflexes, because what we were talking about a minute ago with the spinal cord are these monosynaptic reflexes. So mono meaning one and synaptic meaning synapse, so one synapse reflexes. Polysynaptic reflexes, poly meaning many, synaptic again meaning neural connections or synapses, so we have polysynaptic reflexes as well. So polysynaptic reflexes, we just sort of hinted, involves synapses that have two or more neurons. And we've seen this before with the pain response. So here's another example. We have a pin in the paw that activates these free nerve endings we just talked about in the last lecture. And this then activates the sensory neuron of the dorsal root ganglion. We have an interneuron in the spinal cord, and then we activate an alpha motor neuron to cause the muscle to contract, so we can engage in some sort of a behavior to avoid having this painful pinprick in our foot or in an animal's paw, in the example here. And these paths can be quite long. And so in many cases, we call them a reflex arc, because it could be the 3 neurons you see here, or it could be 300 neurons. But obviously things that we need to happen very quickly to protect ourselves, they often involve fewer and fewer numbers of neurons. So less neurons is better for faster response, less processing time. This paw withdrawal is one example, but another example would be something like a startle reflex that could involve many more neurons. So if something loud comes through, there's an entire circuit for causing a human or an animal to jump and start to make kind of a flight response. And that involves many, many more neurons. So both of these are great examples of a reflex arc. Another good example of a polysynaptic reflex is with the Golgi tendon organ. So remember, these are detecting strain on the tendon itself. And what happens is that these Golgi tendon organs actually connect to inhibitory interneurons. And what they're able to do through this 3 neuron synapse is that if there is an incredible amount of strain on the tendons, then they connect to this inhibitory interneuron and they can shut down our alpha motor neuron. And basically what this does is it tells a muscle to give up, because if it has too much strain on it or something like that, then we need to tell the muscle to stop what it's doing and to just let go of the heavy object that you're carrying or something like that. So whenever you've been moving something and you basically, your muscles are at the point where they're too strained, it's at least in part your Golgi tendon organ that's telling you it's time to let this go, it's time to give up. So for the last little bit of today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview for how movement is controlled by the brain. We're going to spend a whole lot more time talking about this next class, but I want to at least start into this a little bit and give you some hints of how this all starts to come together. So much like we talked about with the visual system, the motor system is not necessarily one system. It's kind of a series of parallel modules that each have their own job that they're responsible for completing. And so in this way, there are quite a few parallel systems that need to interact with one another, and they do come back to generate kind of a bigger motor plan. But in many ways, they're also these kind of separate and parallel systems kind of below the surface that we need to think about. And another thing that's really important here is to reiterate something that we've kind of been talking about this whole time, but for the most part, we've been talking about reflexes and just neurons that are making automatic responses, but movements can be both planned or reflexive. And in most cases, even if you have a movement that's reflexive, it's not that you aren't aware of it. If you really wanted to prevent your doctor from creating a Golgi tendon organ reflex, we've already said you can tighten your muscles, you can inhibit responses from happening. So the planned and reflexive movements can also interact. So when we're talking about the brain and behavior, we're going to focus on how planned movements are carried out, because we have to limit the scope here a little bit. We can't talk about all of the different ways that a movement could be initiated. We're not going to talk about necessarily the systems for driving certain kinds of responses. We're really just talking about how these different systems work and what their responsibilities are. So you might kind of recognize this guy that we're seeing here as being the homunculus that I introduced you to last class with the somatosensory system. And the primary motor cortex, just like the somatosensory cortex, shows a somatotopic organization. So soma, if you remember, we talked about neurons having a soma or a cell body. So soma means body. And so somatotopic, right? Anytime we're talking about topo or topography, we're talking about a map. So somatotopic means map of the body. And this map of the motor system is nearly identical to the somatosensory map. So partially for the shock value of this really ugly homunculus, and partially because it illustrates a point, what I want to show you is a side-by-side comparison of some artist that clearly has way too much time on their hands, but who has these designs for both the sensory and motor homunculus. And so I think you'll notice that these two are relatively similar in some ways, but there are also some notable differences between the two. So one of the easiest ones probably to detect quickly is if you look at the ears, right? Or our ears, we need a whole lot of sensory information from. We're sensitive when things hit our ears, but there's really not any muscle to speak of in or around your ears. And so for the motor system, the ears are not represented at all. There are some other noticeable differences that if you take some time and kind of study, you can figure out. And so the point here is being that, there are many places where sensory and motor are kind of a one-to-one correspondence. For instance, the hands, we have fine motor control, and we also have fine sensory feedback. And so they often go together. Of course, our face for speech and also sensitivity are also fairly one-to-one. But it's not always the case. And that makes a huge difference in exactly how the sensory and motor homunculus look. So they're not a perfect match to one another, but they are very similar. So as I just said a minute ago, our motor system, much like the sensory system, has sort of units or modules. And in the case of the motor system, these relate back to what you just saw in the homunculus. There's specific body parts. But one thing I want to emphasize is it's not just single body parts, it's often groups of body parts that make up a module. And this can be, for example, opposing body parts that we need to control. We often times if we move our left leg forward, we need to do something opposite with the right leg in order to maintain balance. And so having these kind of organized groups working together can be really important. So this brings us to a study by Graziano and Aflafo in 2007 that's, I think, really important for illustrating some of what we're saying here. So if you stimulate the sensory cortex, in many cases people are going to report that they felt a touch on a certain part of the body or something very similar to that. But what Graziano and his group have done a lot of work on, actually, not just this paper, is they've shown that if you stimulate the motor cortex in primates, that you don't necessarily always cause single body parts to move. And if you, again, think back to the history of physiological psychology, we talked about this idea of stimulating causing body parts to move and this idea of functionalism that goes along with it. And it's true, but it's not completely true, because what Graziano and his group have seen is that if you stimulate certain parts of the motor cortex, you don't just necessarily get an arm movement. You get something that's a little bit more complicated than that. For example, you might get a monkey that's reaching and grasping something. And so this suggests that some of what's happening by the time we get to the motor cortex is that there are specific sequences or patterns. And when we activate these separate modules or systems, that we actually start to activate almost pre-programmed responses, and not completely pre-programmed, because we have some free will in the way that we move and we can adapt. But if you think of just the things that you've gotten good at and motor memory and how quickly you can activate certain groups of responses, there are many things that you start out being kind of bad at because you don't necessarily have a pre-programmed sequence or pattern. And after you've been doing something for a while, if you play the piano, or if you dance, or if you're not as active as that, but you're really good at video games, or any number of possibilities, then this is what's happening, is you're activating these specific sequences or patterns. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the gray lag goose, because let's face it, I know you all miss the geese that are at Rutgers because they're cute and they run around, but they also poop a lot and they're kind of stupid. And the gray lag goose is no exception to this. Sorry for all you goose lovers out there, but one example of a fixed action pattern that was first observed in these gray lag geese is that they build these nests kind of up in the mud, and they usually build them up on the top of some sort of a hill where they can find a nice grassy spot. And sometimes what happens is that an egg will get knocked out of the nest. And so what the goose does, they have a great response. They come over and they use their beak, and they'll basically tuck it between their legs, and they'll just scoop, 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 scoop. And that's a fixed action pattern. But what happens is that if the egg rolls down, the goose doesn't stop moving. They don't change their pattern, because this entire sequence has to happen in order. So they have to climb all the way back to the nest, going scoop, 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 scoop. And only when the movement is finished do they look down and say, damn it, the egg rolled back down again. And so they might do this again over and over and over and over again before they finally kind of complete the sequence and then process, oh, the egg is back, now I'm done. So this is a perfect example of how in some cases these sequences or patterns are actually so fixed that they're not modulated as they're ongoing. They have to be pre-planned and executed, and then they come back and are executed again if they fail. In humans, we have a little bit more adaptability than that, but again, geese are stupid. So the last thing you should be asking then is, if we have all these fixed patterns, then how do we put together new movements, and how do we do any of this? And so as a bit of a way to resolve that question and prime you for the next class's material, I just want to introduce you to the supplementary motor area and premotor cortex. And so these two areas are both in the zone that's in green here. They're labeled as premotor cortex only, but they're two separate areas that we think of. And both of these are important for kind of the planning of movements. So the way that we think all of this happens is that we have, of course, all the sensory information coming in, and then we put all of that together and we plan movements, or we plan changes in movements depending on what's happening. And then this information goes to the primary motor cortex, where we can stimulate or activate new patterns or newly planned behaviors in order to create kind of a final motor output that then goes out to all of these muscle fibers that we've been talking about. And as always, if you come up with any questions, feel free to pop into office hours or to try and shoot me an email if the question is a shorter, simpler one. I'm always happy to help. Next class, we'll pick up with the motor system part 2. So if you haven't already, it might be a good time to read the chapter. And then following that, we have our next quiz. Take care, everyone.